Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first episode of the Phanerozoic Podcast. I'm your host, Nature's Compendium, and joining me today is Mr. Jon Perry from Stated Clearly.
Hello, good to be here. This is gonna
Good
be
to have
fun.
you, man. Yes, sir. All right, so I guess we'll just go right into it. I have a couple of questions and topics I want to discuss with you, but we don't have to follow them by a T. So just by starting off, tell us more about how you started Stated Clearly, because I remember seeing your videos went back when I was in high school and college, and
hmm
that's part of the reason why I started doing what I'm doing now.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, my my the reason I started doing videos. I was already working for Oregon State University. I was helping professors prepare their materials for online courses, and we were experimenting with lots of different ways to do that. And some of what I did for them was animation work. I'd been doing animation work before in previous jobs, and so I had always kind of had in the back of my head a desire to do animations that teach evolution.
Mhm.
But the first thing that I got excited about was teaching about DNA, how DNA works. Um, and so my first animation was, what is DNA and how does it work? And that the inspiration for that was just really, I had been very frustrated with how genetics was taught in college. We started with by learning like the molecular structure of nucleotides and so on. And we started at such a technical point that it was just boring. Like I didn't understand what the point of it was. I was just memorizing facts, and it wasn't actually until after college that I realized I finally put it all together in my head to understand really how it works and the DNA's central role in protein coding. And I took an interest in it afterwards, and so I wanted to share it from the interesting parts first, so that students would have a desire to actually go and learn the technical details later and actually understand why it matters. So yeah, my first video was kind of like a rage creation. I
Mhm.
was just enraged by how I was taught this in college and I wanted to do better. So yeah, that was it. I mean, it was that combined with the things that I'd experienced working for the university, combined with yeah my history in graphic design that kind of enabled this to happen.
Right. Excuse me. Well, yeah. So, you said that you started your animation work when you were in Oregon State University, correct?
Yeah,
So what software were you using then, and what do you use now?
I was using the same thing I use now, which is Adobe Animate. I mean,
Mm.
back then I think it was called Flash,
Right.
but it's kind of most people don't use that, and they like cringe when I tell them that that's what I use, because I guess it's complicated to do simple things in this program, but it's what my art style evolved in and my animation style evolved in. So I keep telling myself one day I'll learn some new program, but that's what I'm using, and I like it a lot.
Mhm.
Now,
Well, if you
now you're using, how is it that you do your stuff? Are you drawing your stuff in Illustrator and then animating it in After Effects? Or
Yes,
yeah,
yes, yes. So
yeah.
I draw everything in Adobe Illustrator. Sometimes I do some things in Photoshop.
hmm
But most of the artwork is done in Illustrator, and then I animate everything in After Effects.
yeah.
And that's why there's I draw animals in a specific way, knowing that because this isn't going to be like a frame by frame animation, um I kind of designed them in the way as if they were like puppets. So that way
Yeah. Yep.
the person who I send it over to rig, because I don't do any of the walk cycles. I do all the swimming animals, but the walk
Mhm.
cycles I have another person that I commission do because he does it way better than I could.
Yeah.
So I just make sure that I do all the parenting and artwork for him ahead of time, and then he's able to just make him walk.
Yeah.
But yeah.
That's cool. Yeah. In Flash, I'm making puppets as well. I've got a video on Stated Casually, so my other channel, where I show how I put together one of the puppets, which is a chameleon that eats
I
bugs.
I
Yeah.
actually haven't seen that one yet. Yeah, I've definitely
I'll
got
send
to
you a
watch.
link. Maybe you can put it in the
Oh yeah,
description
for
here.
sure,
But
for sure.
yeah,
Yeah.
that shows how just on all the different layers. And I made that before rigging was available in Flash, so it's just a bunch of nested parts,
Right.
basically.
because
lots of nesting.
so now if I'm not mistaken, like they started incorporating some things that you can do in After Effects in Flash.
Yeah.
Like they added like a rigging tool. So you're, and I also was able to. I wasn't able to pull it off, but I did see that. Um, I could actually import my pictures from Illustrator into Flash now instead of having to draw it in
Yep.
Flash to animate. But I think I'll stick to After Effects for now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See, I actually draw everything in Flash. Like there's the paintbrush tool, which is, and I have a tablet that I draw on.
Mhm.
That's I draw everything in Flash, and that drives people nuts too, because
Yeah.
most I'm doing vector art, and Illustrator is the program for vector art. But I've just found that just the paintbrush tool is pretty much all I need in
Yeah.
Flash.
Well, I wasn't that good with it when I tried it out, but it does kind of remind me of the paintbrush tool that's currently in Illustrator,
Yeah.
where I use so there are two brushes. There's like a blob brush, and that's the one that I mainly use to color, and then there's like
Yeah.
a normal brush for just for like getting fine line work. And
Yeah.
for
The
that
Flash
yeah.
brush is like the blob brush. That they're pretty much
Yeah.
the same. I think that Illustrator designed the blob brush after the Flash brush once Adobe bought Flash. But anyway.
All right, so moving on to the next question. I mean, I guess you kind of explained part of it, but there's more to these videos than animation. So I'd like you to briefly like go over the entire process of creating a video from like start to finish.
Oh yeah. So I'll usually I come up with a topic on my own, or there's like a um I sometimes I do stuff for Oxford, and they'll tell me that, hey, could you do a video on this? Would that make sense for your audience? And if it does make sense for my audience, then I'll do a topic that I work with Stuart West at Oxford, and there are people at other universities that I work with that have funding for stuff. So yeah, I mean, once I have a topic chosen, I'll write a script, and that can be pretty painful. That's the most frustrating part for me, is because I'm trying very hard to make it so that it's really nice and clear, and that it's going to connect with. I'm writing my scripts for the high school version of me, and so it's got to make sense to that key audience. That's the key audience, the demographic that I have in mind. And then what I usually do is I'll have one of the researchers, or several of the researchers who worked on the topic that I'm actually teaching. I'll send it to them to see if they're willing to review it. And more often than not, they are. Like, you can just email people and ask them, and sometimes they'll say, yeah. It's people are a lot more accessible than I imagined they would be before I started this project. But so I try and get feedback from the actual researchers that are working in the field, to make sure that everything's legitimate. Because when you're creating a short animation about a topic, you're summarizing people's work, and when you summarize things, you always run the risk of teaching it wrong, or just highlighting things that the actual researchers are like, I would not highlight that part, I'd highlight this part. So it's really good to get feedback from them. And then I start animating, and the animation part usually is fairly quick. It could be well, it can be 2 weeks to 2 months, actually, depending on it. It's like sometimes I'll have 3D animation stuff, and I have to coordinate with someone who does 3D animation. Sometimes I have a lot of feedback from a funder. If I'm working with Oxford, for example, I'll do a lot of back and forth, and that can really extend how long things take. But if I'm just doing an animation that I've planned, it's between 2 weeks to a month for the animation. But I'll spend many months writing scripts. I'm usually working on multiple projects at a time, and I'll be going back and forth with researchers. So that's actually the longest. Usually the most time consuming part is perfecting a script, but I'm doing that, part time. I'm mixing lots of projects together at the same time when I'm doing that. So yeah, it's kind of a messy process, but it works all right.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's good that you mentioned all this, because I think whenever people watch these kinds of videos, especially like animated content, they see like the 13 minutes of animation happening or like pictures or whatnot. They don't see the hours and hours and days and months
Yeah.
behind each project.
Yeah.
And that's why I always have like really like huge respect for people who do traditional animation, because that's like a whole other beast on its own.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. If you look at what I'm doing as far as animation goes, occasionally I'll have a puppet rigged that's somewhat complex, but for the most part, things are coming on screen and then sliding off screen. And it's kind of like I mean,
Motion
I would say,
graphics in a way, like motion graphics.
yeah, just really simple. I mean, it's just I'm showing a badger, but the badger doesn't even move. It's just I'm talking about a badger and I show a picture of a badger, and then sometimes it'll move a little bit or it'll maybe blink its eyes or something to keep it interesting. But yeah, most of it is fairly simple. I'll have a thing of DNA and it's on screen and it's all it's doing is scrolling slowly, and that's enough to keep you looking at it. But it's those are things I've done to cut down on the production length, because you could spend years on one animation. A lot of animators that are really just about the art of animation, they'll spend years on a 5-minute animation. So,
or especially if they're working by themselves.
Right. Yeah.
Oh yeah. What should we talk about next? Sorry, my mind just went blank for a second.
Yeah.
There was something I wanted to ask you. It's not on this list, but it's fine. All right, so in your latest project, you mentioned, in your latest project, you made a video about genetic conflict and how genes cooperate. Could you go into more detail about that for us?
Yeah, so in general, people think of the genome as, everything's in cooperation and everything works together to build the cell. A lot of times people talk about the genome as the computer of the cell or the brain of the cell and so on. But in reality, stretches of DNA are evolving independently from each other, and they can actually be in conflict with each other sometimes. So you can think of the genome as an ecology, as an ecosystem. So, together they're generating a lot of, they're doing a lot together, but they're not necessarily in cooperation with each other. Because of the way that cells reproduce, they reproduce all together, and organisms reproduce all together, like the whole thing does. You do get a lot of just really easy, obvious understanding of why genes tend to cooperate, because the best way for a gene to survive and reproduce is to help the organism as a whole survive and reproduce, right? But you actually do get, from time to time, you get cheating genes that will pop up. So the one that I talk about in the animation is one that skews the sex ratio to be just female, and so it's a gene on the X chromosome, and so to promote the X chromosome, you can promote you can kill sperm that have Y chromosomes in them, and so this is actually a type of mutation that pops up a lot in organisms, where the X chromosome sperm will kill Y chromosome sperm, or vice versa. Y chromosome sperm will kill X chromosome sperm. And what that does is it makes sure that all the offspring are either male or female. So it's a huge immediate evolutionary advantage for that chromosome, for that sex chromosome, because it ends up in all of the offspring instead of half of them like it normally would. But of course, that ends up being bad for basically all the other genes in the genome.
And the species as a whole.
Right. And the video talks about how it is that just normal natural selection will kind of auto-correct for that, because what happens is as males become more rare, it becomes more beneficial for any gene to be in the body of a male, because that male is going to find multiple mates and have lots of offspring. Whereas the females are kind of like fighting over mates. And of course the opposite is true when it's skewed the other way. So if it's skewed the other way, it's best to be a female, because all the males are going to be fighting over one female. So any gene that suffers a mutation that happens to make it more likely to be in a male's body when things are skewed in a male's favor. That gene will end up spreading really far. And one of the ways that a gene can do that is by attacking the gene that kills Y sperm. So you end up just getting an automatic evolution of a correction of this error. And we see this in the laboratory, we see it in our mathematical models, and we see it in the wild. So this is what's happening. You have this really, really cool system of basically cheating genes and then policing genes that evolve to police the cheating genes. So underneath the hood of a cell, there's a lot of cooperation, and then there's a lot of these little fights that are happening between different genes in the genome. And it's kind of this beautiful mess that is evolution.
When you mentioned the how like natural selection will find a way to autocorrect, and when you mentioned the how there are some genes that basically delete the Y chromosome or make it impossible or make it less likely for males to be born. I wonder if like maybe that's why like in some animals parthenogenesis came to be, or like animals are able to like reproduce without the presence of a male, albeit like the downside is that it only produces like female offspring. Like I believe there's like a species of lizard where they've completely just reproduced through like parthenogenesis like over and over again. So now it's just the entire population is female.
Yeah, you know? and there are some major disadvantages to that. Like they are not able to purge negative mutations nearly as efficiently as organisms that have sexual reproduction. So we actually think that probably all of those lineages they're probably doomed to eventual mutational meltdown. Because animals as complex as we are, we're highly susceptible to mutational meltdowns.
Right.
And sexual reproduction, we don't know exactly what triggered the evolution of sexual reproduction, but we do know what sexual reproduction is doing for us today. And that is one of the big things that it's stopping us from suffering mutational meltdown. There's through the process of meiosis and sexual reproduction, we're able to take negative mutations, get them all onto one chromosome, and then that chromosome gets purged. So it's sexual reproduction is very important for maintaining clean genomes, essentially.
Right. Actually, what you just said reminded me of something that happened recently. So I was playing this game called Valorant with some friends. It's like a online shooter game. And one of my friends mentioned how like I believe he's currently like doing his undergrad in bio, and he mentioned that like I mentioned how there's some I was trying to like briefly explain like gain of function, where like a virus could basically transmutate with DNA from like another virus and use that to its advantage, or from like a host organism. But his understanding was, but what about hybrids, like, and animals? Because whenever you have like a donkey and a horse mate, then you end up with a mule, and the mule can't reproduce. So in theory, if a virus had DNA from like other organisms, wouldn't that make it weaker as well? And I'm guessing like
it can. It just depends on what happens. So viruses do we call it recombination in viruses. So let's say you have two strains of HIV that someone is infected with, the flu, way more common. The flu is it's actually way more it's way easier for this to happen with the flu too, because the flu has multiple chromosomes.
Right.
And so if you get infected by two flu strains at the same time, they can enter the same cell, and they start making copies of their genomes, and they start making copies of their proteins, and those proteins end up packaging the genomes, and then that's into new little viruses, and those go out into the world and infect someone else. Well, they can package half their genome from one of the strains and half from the other strain, and that might end up being beneficial. It might end up being fatal to the virus, but it might end up being beneficial to the virus. And this is why the virus this is one way that viruses evolve rapidly. And this is one of the reasons that we're so concerned with COVID, with the fact that it also gets into some animals. So there's like minks, for example, can get COVID. So you can
Some
get
apes as well, I believe.
right,
Yeah.
right. So we've seen in real time the evolution of COVID to become more benign in humans, right? Which is awesome. The current strain is really transmissible, but it doesn't kill people. It's not nearly as lethal as the earlier strains. But because we also have strains in minks and so on, you know, it's normal for a virus to become benign in its main host because
Right.
the virus doesn't benefit from killing its host. In fact, it's it spreads more rapidly when its host is active and out in the social its social circle spreading the disease. So because of that, respiratory viruses tend to become benign over time. But because it's also evolving in minks and becoming benign to minks, and minks are different than humans, you can get a hybrid to form, essentially, in a mink. So between the human and mink version, that could pass back into humans and be lethal again because it's not yet used to our bodies. So this is one of the fears that people have, like, oh, great, we could be plagued with deadly versions of this again indefinitely. And
Or
this is
from
something
other
we,
viruses
yeah,
too.
this is a problem with the flu as well, because the flu gets into swine and it gets into chickens, and so there's always that chance of something horrible coming out of the meat industry, for example.
Oh yeah. But yeah, and also I guess there's a bit of a disconnect between like how asexual organisms reproduce versus sex animals that
Yeah,
reproduce sexually and so on. And
yeah,
then with the whole, and of course on top of that, viruses aren't technically living, so that's usually takes people some time to wrap their heads around as well.
yeah. I mean, that doesn't really matter for their evolution. I mean, you can kind of think of them evolving in a similar way that bacteria do. But so viruses don't reproduce sexually, bacteria don't reproduce sexually, but viruses do something similar in that what we just talked about with this crossover thing that can happen when two viruses infect one cell. That's similar to sexual reproduction in that they get gene exchange between individuals.
Right.
And then you have a very similar thing in bacteria, which can happen in multiple different ways through conjugation, where they actually will find each other and fuse together and swap genes with each other. It's very, very similar to sexual reproduction, except for it's not usually their whole genomes that they're swapping.
It's just parts and so on.
Yeah. And then there's bacteria can also just grab chunks of DNA in the environment and pull them into their bodies. So there's lots of ways to do this. There's lots, and these are all different ways that different organisms have evolved that also help them avoid things like mutational meltdown. But yeah, the genomes are crazy. I mean, it's really fun to think of them. It's really helpful to think of a genome as a population of evolving entities.
Right. Instead of thinking of it as a library of information. Because that's kind of like how we're taught to think of it, as like this is how it codes for the protein or so on.
Yeah, both of those ways of thinking are useful in different circumstances, but yeah, it's
but I do believe like what you mentioned is better to think of it from like the evolutionary perspective,
yeah,
like how organisms are evolving from the genetic scale.
Yeah, and especially like it's totally fine to think of the genome as just one thing, the nucleus is an organ of the cell. But when there are weird things that are happening and we don't understand why, it helps to look at the individual genes as evolving entities, and that's where you'll find more answers, because organisms evolve, but also individual genes evolve, and individual genes are the smallest entities that are capable of Darwinian evolution. And so if looking at the population of organisms isn't helping you solve the weird problem that you're confronted with in biology, that means that maybe you need to dive in deeper and look at a lower level that's where evolution is occurring. And so it might be the cellular level, it might be the actual gene level. It's actually the most appropriate place to be looking at all times, but you don't always need to be obsessed with looking at the gene's eye view of evolution unless there's some problem that's arisen. It's usually a shortcut to look at just organisms in general. But anyway,
Yeah. Yeah. No, that was very insightful. So moving on to the next subject I wanted to touch on. We were talking mainly about like evolution from the genetic level and so on, but now I want to kind of segue into like evolutionary biology, like just in general as a science, like how
Hmm.
that's because I noticed that like that's I wouldn't say that's your only focus, but that is like a very like primary focus of your channel. And I
Yeah.
do believe like what you're doing is very helpful, like making evolution more understandable to the common audience. So I'd like you to like elaborate more on that and how you come up with projects and how you choose to like approach this subject.
Yeah. My so I mentioned before that my target audience is me back when I was in high school, right? Well, I
Mm-hmm.
was raised the religion that I was raised in isn't actually young earth creationist religion, but one of my Sunday schools when I was really young she was a young earth creationist, and so
Mm.
she would tell us that evolution is evil and so on. And so I had that like in my head even all the way up through high school. So when I'm teaching evolutionary biology, my I've got that in mind. Like, what were the things that were hard for me? Like, I mean, it was almost painful learning about this stuff, because I had this, I had this deep like resistance to wanting to learn about it because it was at odds with what I thought that my religious views had to be. Like, it was somehow sinning if I was looking. I remember when I was a little kid, I was interested in evolution because I watched a David Attenborough documentary, and I remember that afterwards, this was before the internet was a thing in people's
Right.
houses. I'm kind of old, but
Um,
my dad had a huge shelf just of encyclopedias, and I remember I would look under the evolution, in the encyclopedia, and I'd read about evolution. And I remember my dad walked in one time and I shut it like it was a dirty magazine or something. I didn't want him
yeah,
to
I
know
was
that I was
thinking,
studying evolution.
yeah, I was thinking that like, oh no, I'll watch. It's evolution. I swear, it's even worse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was that was the type of person that was the stress that I had learning about this stuff, and so I've kept that in mind. Um, I I consider my audience to be people like me at that time, to where I was curious. I was very curious about biology. I wanted to understand biology. So it's not that I was like dumb or not curious or something, but it was just stressful, and so I couldn't spend a lot of energy, and I wasn't willing to spend a lot of energy doing this. And so I believe that when I'm creating these animations, I need to make it so that it's quick, it's easy to understand, it's information packed. And that's one of the reasons that I wanted to use animation, is like with animation, I can pack a lot of information in a very short amount of time. So it's not a huge investment for the viewer. Uh,
Right.
I also try not to be triggering with things like I find that I found that for me, when I was learning about evolution, it was a lot easier to learn about it with um, various animals rather than talking about human evolution, because human evolution, it was just, it brought too much stress to me.
Right.
So just teaching how these principles work in animals that are cool, like whales or badgers and things like that. It's a lot. It's just easier emotionally for people, I feel like. And
Right.
then they might end up being curious eventually to learn about human evolution. I do have some videos on human evolution, but very few. I've got one on uh, endogenous retroviruses linking humans to chimps, right? But the yeah, that's what I've found is helpful, is just to keep it short, keep it friendly, keep it information packed, so that the viewer doesn't have to invest a lot into it. This can be just presented to, they can just kind of passively absorb this information. The other thing that I do is I pay very close attention to the creationist arguments, and I write these scripts with those in mind. Uh, I I'm also very careful to it. I'm using animations to show to illustrate principles, but when I'm trying to show actual evidence, I just use photos or videos,
Mm.
actual
Right.
footage so people can see it with their own eyes instead of have to trust a cartoon or an illustration, right?
Right. Yeah, no. What was I gonna get at here? Oh yeah, I was about to say, it says we have 7 minutes left, so we can
Ah,
just like start up and finish once the timer goes down.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, no, I do remember like one of the first videos I saw of yours was where it was like a whale skeleton. Because
Hmm.
at the time, I guess a bit of background for me, I was raised like super like conservative Muslim, and they're not like young Earth creationists, but they don't really believe in evolution. My family
Hmm.
upbringing. And even as a kid, I had to actually read The Origin of Species because I was taken to like this like Islamic conference for youth, and yeah, I don't think I told you this, but like I had to
Mm-mm.
debate for and against evolution.
Oh, really?
And you know, me being like super into dinosaurs or whatnot, I also had some books. I had like some basic understanding of it, but actually reading The Origins of Species, mind you, this was around the time when I was like in middle school. That's
You read
kind
the
of
whole
what's
book in middle school?
no. Yeah,
Oh,
I read the Spark notes.
okay.
But because the debate was in like 3 days, so like I can't read this. But
Yeah.
I lost my original copy, but I do have it
Yeah.
like as an audiobook, and it's something I like to listen to from time to time.
Hmm.
But I definitely like that definitely is what kind of like led me down that path or that rabbit hole of like wanting to learn more and more about
Yeah.
it, because I'm like, oh, this actually kind of made sense.
Hmm.
And I even learned that like even though I'm not really like religious anymore, like I learned in throughout like Islamic history, there were like scientists within the Muslim world that came up with very similar theories to like Darwin.
Yeah.
I believe I mentioned his name to you once. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but there
Yeah.
was like a I believe he was like an Abyssinian scientist, or not a scientist, but like a naturalist who would observe animals, and he wrote a book
Hmm.
called The Book of Animals, where like he mentioned how ostriches with the harder eggshells, like their offspring were more likely to survive and not get eaten by hyenas. Or he mentioned
Yeah.
how these different populations within the Middle East, some who had like lighter colored hair, they had lighter colored lice, whereas those who had darker color hair had darker color lice. So he made like very notable observations, and this was
Hmm.
like almost 1,000 years before like Darwin stepped foot on the Galapagos. So to me,
Yeah.
like learning that was really cool.
Yeah. It's really interesting to think. I mean, the theory of evolution is actually really obvious when you have access to a lot of biodiversity.
Right.
If you're surrounded by biodiversity, it just kind of becomes clear that this is what's going on. And I'm sure that before Darwin, hundreds of people independently came to the same conclusion. I mean, even at the same time that Darwin came to this conclusion, Wallace independently came to the conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
I was actually reading recently there's the joint letter that from Wallace and Darwin that was read, I think at the
Right.
Royal Society or something,
Mm-hmm.
where they both presented the theory of evolution by natural selection together. It was presented for them by I think Charles Lyell or something, but you know it was independently discovered by two different people, and the reason for that is that England at the time had been collecting lots of specimens of animals, and they've been
Mm-hmm.
putting them in museums. So the average British person had access to all this biodiversity from the entire globe, you know, during colonialization times, and they were yeah they were exposed to it, and then Darwin himself actually got to travel the world when he was a young man, and he noticed all the stuff himself doing that. And Wallace, same thing. He was visiting tropical rainforests, and it just becomes obvious that this is
Right.
what's going on. And I'm sure that people had discovered this way before Darwin, and it just they didn't have the clout, you know, like the cultural clout, or they didn't have the uh, you know, there wasn't writing, there wasn't a official scientific organization where you would have people who argue
Right.
about things and try and figure out what's actually true and what's not. So it it's just the fact that Darwin had he was wealthy enough to write books at that time, and he had friends that were connected. It's really half about that and half about the discovery, you know.
Mm-hmm. All right. So both of us briefly mentioned our upbringings and so on, and how that kind of like in some ways or another, for you, it helps like guide you on how you create your content, knowing like you're looking back at your younger self. This is how, as someone who was a high schooler, would like this information presented to me, and as
Mhm.
somebody who was a creationist, like warming up to evolution, this is how I'd want it presented to me. Are there any additional challenges or things you keep in mind when you are doing like these types of science communication videos?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's the science standards that are used in high school. I try and keep those in mind as well because I want teachers to be able to use these in their classrooms. But then also there's the creationist movement. What they're doing is they just look at the science and they find ways to vandalize it. So they're trying to find ways to make arguments that seem like they're good common sense arguments but they're just they're trying to get you not to look. They're trying to get you to look the other way. So I keep that in mind, and I try to make that really difficult for them, as difficult as possible. So every time I'm creating a script, I'm thinking, how are people going to sabotage this?
Mm.
And it's interesting to see how they end up actually doing it. So like I've got a channel now that does everything in my art style, and it's a creationist channel. So they do stuff on. They're trying to sabotage all my videos, which is really interesting. But the one of the things that they did on my whale video, for example, is they talk about the fact that whale hips are still used for reproduction. And so they say, oh, yeah, whales have hips, but that has nothing to do with actual hips. It's just for sexual reproduction. So that's like one of the little tricks that they'll use to try and get you, don't look, don't pay attention to all this
Other
glaring evidence.
right.
But of course, our hips are also used to attach sex organs onto. So
Mhm.
we use hips for our legs and for our reproductive organs. Whales lost the leg part of that, and they've only maintained the reproductive organ part of it. So it's a non
Right.
it's a non-argument. But
Well, I guess like there's two aspects to that. Let's just say for like the benefit of the doubt, whales like this no the whales possessing hip bones no longer is a valid argument for their evolution from land animals. But what about all the but like the issue with that is that you can't really discredit one thing and then ignore basically every other line of evidence, like from
right.
the genetic code showing that they're more closely related to hoofed mammals like hippos and horses,
Mm-hmm.
or the fossil record where we have like whales that look like transitional forms like Basilosaurus or Dorodon, or even
Yep.
one of my favorites, Coronodon.
Yeah.
Not responsible for the virus, but the reason why I like that one is because its teeth are transitional between like the toothed whales and baleen whales, the way that
Yeah.
they're designed. So it's very similar to like the teeth of a crab eater seal. And
Mm-hmm.
crab eater seals eat krill, so they believe that this is kind of like one of the intermediate steps into baleen that we see today.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's that aspect. And then on top of that, it's like the second thing I take issue with is even if you were to somehow discredit every single line of evidence for evolution, and I don't see that happening like ever, but let's
Mm-hmm.
just say that even if that were possible, the counter solution you're providing for these answers has already either been falsified from a like objective reality perspective, or it just doesn't hold up to scientific scrutiny, and it just isn't a good it doesn't explain like the reality we live in, you know,
Mm-hmm.
without having to take like large leaps of faith or so on.
Yeah. Yeah. The main tactic that I see them doing is if I've got, so in the case of the whale video, now I've got multiple lines of evidence showing how that whales evolved from land animals. And you'll see someone make a video about one fact, and they'll say, well, this could be something else instead. Maybe they just happen to have, maybe whales just happen to have fingers in their flippers because that's how God designed them.
Right. It's instead of common ancestry, they're like, it's not common ancestry, it's a common creator. Well, it could be
Right.
both. Could be both, but
Now you could just have coincidentally, maybe it could just be a total coincidence that there's arm, hand, and finger bones inside of a whale's front flipper. It's sure, but then that coincidence, it's obvious what that coincidence means when you look at the fossil record, when you look at genetics, when you look at all these other things, you see, oh, that's definitely, it's because that's literally a hand that's been transformed into a flipper.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll respond by trying to make arguments about one thing individually, because there's no other conclusion to draw when you see all the different lines of evidence than, oh, okay, this evolved from a land animal. Obviously, that's what happened here. So it's, just little tricks like that. And so I do try to pay attention when I'm writing a script as to, what tactics do people use in the past? How can I make that difficult for them to make about this video? And so, the only option that people have for my videos is to basically convince their audience not to watch them by picking just one argument made in the video and pretending that's the entire argument in the video. So I mean, there's nothing I can do against that. But it's interesting to see how people try to vandalize the science.
At least, like, I guess I wouldn't say like YouTube has gotten like better or worse about it, because they definitely has like the algorithms have done a lot for like magnifying echo chambers. But I will say that I do like how you're not really, like, nobody's forcing you to watch or not watch it. And a lot of people, like my younger self, for example, like we see a video on evolution as an individual, just curious, and if it's presented in a good way, like the way that you do your stuff, then it gets us hooked, and we end up doing a little bit of more self-investigation and self-exploring. Like, I even remember, like, growing up, my family would make me watch like religious videos with them, and there's like one imam, and imam's like a Muslim priest, who would always say stuff like, well, evolution is just a theory. He never actually addresses it, or he never, and everyone says, oh, it's just a theory. Yeah, well, so is gravity. That's a theory, and we're not floating away. Though I think that also kind of ties in with a colloquial misunderstanding of what theory means in science versus what it means like in commonplace language, right?
A theory in science can be like, you can have fairly loose theories in science, but an established theory in science is very different than what people think of as a theory. A theory is the description that ties all the facts together. So you can think of it as if you think of one analogy I use is, imagine waking up in a castle and you're just waist high in puzzle pieces, and you don't know if the puzzle pieces fit together to make a picture or anything. You're just waist high in these puzzle pieces. Those would be like the observable facts, right? That we have, that scientists are dealing with. And scientists are trying to take those facts and arrange them into a picture that gives us understanding of what the picture is, right?
Right.
So a theory would be the arrangement of those facts into a coherent, understandable picture. And that's what we're doing. And you get competing theories sometimes. So people have the same pieces and they're arranging them in different ways. And like, I think this is a picture of Mona Lisa. No, I think this is a picture of a cross dresser, or whatever. So the whatever it happens to be, you'll have these competing theories, and then one will eventually win out because it keeps on leading us to the correct picture will point out where you're missing pieces and what those pieces should look like. It helps you predict what you're missing, and then you can go out and find it. So that's what a good theory does. And bad theories just end up not leading to any new discoveries, so they eventually get discarded.
Right.
So we have an established scientific theory like the theory of evolution. It's got millions of facts that are a part of that theory, and it's leading us constantly to new information. That's why it's valuable. That's why scientists keep working underneath the evolutionary theory instead of some other theory. And if you want to replace the theory of evolution, it's easy. All you have to do is arrange those same observations in a way that makes more sense and leads us to more discoveries. That's it.
As well as like future discoverings, further what's the word I'm looking for? I guess further proving or further supporting the theory that you mentioned. Because that's like another thing with evolution. Darwin didn't know anything about genetics. He didn't know the full extent of the fossil record. He didn't know about atavism activation or the molecular clock. And these are things we've discovered post Darwin, and all of them end up supporting evolution as well. So there's that. Oops.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, like, even you said that you had to read The Origin of Species. It's kind of funny that a lot of people who are religious consider that to be like, oh, the Bible of evolution or something. In science, is not actually how you work. If you want to learn how evolution works, you read a modern textbook. Right. But that was like the first thinkings about this that anyone had and really formalized. So there's a bunch of stuff in The Origin of Species is just flat out wrong. But there's a lot of stuff, the core principles that he hit on: descent with modification, acted upon by selection, like those are rock solid. Like those are the pillars of how we understand evolution to work today. But there's tons of stuff in that book that are wrong. So the science is this ongoing, it's an ongoing collection of observable facts and an ongoing argument about what those facts might mean. Right. And so theories transform quite a bit over time. The core that Darwin gave us is still there, but a lot of the details are now very different.
Oh yeah. I think another thing that kind of leads to misconceptions, or not just misconceptions, but I do see creationists mistruth this a lot. Whenever you see like a linear chart of different animals like evolving from one to the next, obviously everybody has that image of like the monkey going into a person or whatnot. I do see this a lot with like whale evolution, where they're like, oh, these evil evolutionists, they find a misplaced animal and they put it on this tree to make it make sense, even though like X, Y, and Z, like it was actually from this time period. An example I'll give is this animal called Indohyotis.
Oh yeah.
So you know what I'm referring to, right?
So they're saying that sometimes the chronologically the order is not perfect.
Yes, specifically with that animal, it lived, I believe, around like 42 million years ago. But then you have like in most charts they lead from Indohyotis to Pakicetus, and then from Pakicetus to Ambulocetus. But Pakicetus lived before Indohyotis. And what these people, or like what the layman person doesn't actually quite understand, is Indohyotis isn't representing the actual direct ancestor. It's representing the sister taxa that split off from whales,
right,
leading into that. And same with a lot of the other animals that are being used, because in some cases, some animals within like the Pakicetus or Ambulocetus group of animals that were transitioning from land to water, some of them went back to land, some of them kept going into the water, and some of them like diverged, and so on and so on. So it's not it's just like the linear image. It's good for like getting people to kind of understand or like introduce them to descent with modification, but it's not an accurate image of how it actually works.
And I think a lot of that, I mean, that's a good example of where creationists getting angry at something is totally warranted, because a lot of times you will have in some older textbooks and in some museum exhibits, you'll have it displayed as if like Tiktaalik is the ancestor of all land vertebrates, right? Tiktaalik is not the ancestor of all land vertebrates. Tiktaalik is a representative of one of those early forms. So if you look at an actual evolutionary tree in a good textbook today, I could try and find one, but you'll find branches. So each of these fossil organisms is on its own branch, and then there's a fork, and then the branch continues onward to another one, and until you get to modern organisms. And the reason for that is, I like to explain it like if you got invited to a family reunion, say you don't know who your grandparents are, and you get a cousin finds you and says, "Hey, come to our family reunion. You can meet your grandpa." And you get there, and there's like 5 guys that look kind of like you that are old enough to be your grandpa. You don't know which one's your actual grandpa, right? They might be your grandpa's brothers or something. But so you can never say with certainty unless you actually know, unless you have really detailed information, which one is my actual grandpa. So this is what we're doing in the fossil record, is we're we're saying, oh, this organism is in the ballpark, and so we put a branch, we put it on a separate branch. We always assume it's a sister group. It's never the actual direct ancestor, because the chances of it being the actual direct ancestor or an actual representative from that species is, of course, less likely than it being a sister group, right?
I'm actually kind of guilty. I just realized I am a little guilty of this in my last two videos, where I show like a brief progression of different animals leading from like one animal to the main one. And originally I did this before, where I had a disclaimer saying, no, this isn't a direct representation of the descent. This is just to give a general idea of what, but I didn't do it for the last two. So that is something I'm gonna keep in mind when I cover like evolution again for certain animals.
Yeah, the other thing that the other creationist argument that I think is good is, well, there's two more worth talking about. One is they'll get frustrated with fossil recreations where all the bones are shown and it's not clear which ones were actually found and which ones were speculated to have been found, to have been part of that organism. So like that's actually been a pet peeve of mine forever. Like if you go to a museum, sometimes it's very hard to tell. And that drives me nuts, because like the justification that people have for doing that, for creating the whole animal from just a few bones, is that that's what people have been doing since the start of paleontology. That's just the tradition. But it's and they're doing it with a lot of information. Like they know from lots of experience, if it has this bone on this side, it's going to have the same bone on the other side, and etc. But for the audience, it's good to show them what was actually found in that specific dig, and what we know should be there because of comparisons with other animals. And that's something that's not often done in museum exhibits.
Right. But I think like there are like two sides to that. Obviously you don't want to like show the real fossils in like a cast, but I do think they should highlight what parts of the animal were actually discovered.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, like not every dinosaur is T-Rex, where you have like a huge sample size of these animals, right?
Yeah.
Most dinosaur. Heck, like a couple of years ago, they found like, I think it was like one vertebrae, and they were like, yep, this is an abylosaur, and we're going to name it Thanos, of all things.
Yeah.
Off of one bone. And I'm like, this is, you guys are doing too much. Like, you don't even know how this animal looks like. I mean, obviously you can make very, very well like educated guesses, and we do actually know like a lot more than we lead on when it comes to like paleontology, but at the same time there's still a lot we don't know. And I think that it would be healthier just for like, you know, just for communicating to the public where we actually stand, especially with fragmentary specimens.
Yeah, so if you look at anytime I show a fossil reconstruction in my animations, I draw it, and there's a little key underneath showing you the different colors. So I have the colors pretty close, so it doesn't ruin your ability to look at the whole animal together. But I have a key underneath there showing you what the different colors mean. So I'll have one shade of a color for the bones that were actually found in a single individual, another shade for bones that were reconstructed from multiple individuals, and then I would have a third color for the things that are assumed to be there because they're just missing. And like we know how animals are structured, and this should have 5 vertebrae between these two right here. So all that stuff is transparent for the audience, so they can make what they want of that information.
Next time you do a fossil, you should do like purple for the discovered elements, and then bright neon yellow for the undiscovered. So that way they'll know for sure. So
yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I don't want it to. I use similar colors. I mean, it's obvious when you're looking at it. I even test it to make sure it works in black and white for people that are colorblind. But you also want people to be able to see it what the actual animal would have looked like. So you don't want to ruin it when you're doing it. There's ways to go overboard with this, but yeah.
It's funny you mentioned that, because I have a friend of mine who really likes hadrosaurs, and he's colorblind, and I made a hadrosaur with like gray with like dark gray spots. And he's like, I hate you so much. I don't know. I can't tell what pattern this is. And I'm like, oops,
Yeah.
maybe I'll take that one back to the drawing board. But yeah, that is something I haven't really kept in mind as much as I
Yeah.
should about like people who are colorblind.
Yeah.
Okay.
Photoshop is really cool because they have two different colorblind modes that you
Oh,
can
they
view
do.
your stuff in on
Interesting.
Photoshop. And so you can tell, like I've used that a lot when I'll color diagrams, and the colors are supposed to be super obvious in these diagrams. Then you look at it in a colorblind mode and you're like, ah, crap, those are almost identical shades.
Yeah.
So yeah, there are two main
Write that
types of
down.
color blindness. I can't remember which one's most common, but both of them are in Photoshop. Has it shows you what both of them look like.
Yeah, you heard it here, folks. Take some notes. He's dropping some gems here. But yeah, segueing into that, could you what was I gonna say? Oh yeah, are there any like words of advice you'd like to give to other creators who are in the space? Because I am seeing a lot of like people wanting to become like science or like natural history based creators, and it's really great seeing. So
Yeah.
as someone who's been doing this for almost 10 years, what do you think is your like best advice you could give?
Yeah, my best advice would be to just like assume that people can be contacted, other people in the field can be contacted. Write letters to, if you got a question about a subject, write to the scientists who actually studied that. Respect their time. I mean, keep the email brief, make it known to them that you've read their work and you have, these are the specific questions that I have. And usually I'll try, and when I'm writing a letter cold to someone, I'll keep it like, I have one sentence explaining who I am, and then like one sentence explaining that I know what they're working on, and somehow proving that by maybe, dropping the technical terms that they're using or whatever, or mentioning a specific paper. And then I will ask them a question. So it's very, very streamlined emails when I'm first contacting someone. And the same is possible for other YouTubers. Like if a YouTuber writes me an email, I'll definitely respond if they're being respectful of my time and they're asking me a specific question. Of course, I will respond. I'm happy to. And that's, you can cut so many corners and stop yourself from going down so many dead ends if you just reach out to people. People are more accessible than you would imagine. Yeah.
All right, so last couple of questions, and then I'll let you go.
Mhm.
So what is your favorite video that you've worked on to date for Stated Clearly?
It's hard. Well, I think that the most useful video that I've ever made, I'm pretty sure, is what is DNA and how does it work? That was the first one that I made. I really am proud of it. I was able to get people excited about the field and understand genetics in just 5 minutes. Understand the basics of genetics in just 5 minutes. But honestly, after someone watches that video, they can now understand the arguments being made in the Jurassic Park novel. They can understand most arguments that are being made in the media, like in the news, about genetics and genetics issues.
Right.
That it'll suddenly make sense to them. Whereas before, it might sound like this magical, whatever, super complex thing. So I am most proud of that video. But the video I liked doing the most was the video on whale evolution. That's,
The
I
different lines
think,
of evidence.
yeah, that one was a lot of fun. So what is the evidence for evolution? That was really fun to make. It's had a really big impact on people, and my dogs are howling right now. I don't know if you can hear that.
Oh, I can.
Yeah.
They're like, hey, you've been talking to this jerk for too long, you know.
No, what happened
Nice.
is my wife just left for
Oh.
somewhere, and they're howling. They mourn her loss every time she leaves. They don't do it for me. It's jerks.
Yeah,
They only howl for her.
that's literally my leopard gecko is up there. He just like once in a while he'll just like stare at me and then go back in his cave, but he never like acknowledges me until I give him food. I'm like,
Yeah.
that's fine. Hey, low
Yeah.
maintenance, it's all good.
Yeah.
But yeah, are there any future projects that you have in mind that you'd like to share with us, or are you gonna keep that a secret for now?
I don't know. Right now, I'm working on two. I'm working on one on what is the difference between RNA and DNA? And that's one where I'm really going to dive in and finally look at the molecular structure of these molecules to see how form enables function. So our cells use RNA and DNA in very different ways, but they're really similar molecules. And it's these slight differences in the atomic structure of these molecules that the cells over evolutionary time have magnified those differences and exploited them for different uses. So that's a really fun video. Hopefully it'll be useful in high schools and colleges.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other one that I'm doing is on hopeful monsters. And so, Darwin talked about evolution happening very gradually. But there are some times where a single change can actually be fairly large. And so I'm doing a video about those rare cases and asking the question, how important might these rare jumps be in evolution? And what really is possible, and how big of a jump can we actually expect in a single from parent to child, one jump, So that'll be a fun one too. This always comes up. There's always a young biologist who will say, "Oh, I think evolution happens in large jumps," and then it's fun. It's a fun idea to explore.
Yeah, that's the one I'm looking forward to the most. And last question: favorite dinosaur?
My favorite dinosaur is Triceratops, just classic Triceratops. I had a toy when I was a kid, and he's my favorite. It was between him and T-Rex, so I'm pretty basic as far as dinosaur love goes.
Yeah, I mean, I'd argue that T-Rex definitely gets more love than Triceratops, but like that animal was built as a tank specifically to like kill defend and kill animals like T-Rex that tried to fight her, so on. So there's that.
I love that an animal that armored, he's got the 3 horns, and it's also because he looks like a Jackson chameleon. That we've still got a little Triceratops looking thing alive today. So
I wonder if that is a case of convergent evolution. Like, I'm not sure what they have the horns for.
It's definitely their horns are used for. I'm pretty sure they don't use them for anything. It's to attract mates. I think it's only the males that have them. I think. Don't quote me on that, but that there have been arguments in the past that that's what Triceratops was doing too, but
like using its horns and frills like as a display structure.
Yeah, and in fact, some people have argued that they weren't for defense at all, but I think that's been, like, for the most part, that's a rejected idea. It does seem like they were using them for defense, but
Well, again, thank you so much, Jon. It was a pleasure speaking with you. I'd love to do this again more often, but thank you.
Thanks for having me. It's good.
Of course.